Want a coworker to genuinely like you more? Don't do them a favor. Ask them for one instead. It sounds completely backwards the very first time you hear it described out loud, and yet it's one of the most consistently replicated findings in the entire field of social psychology, and it has a direct, immediately practical use in management that almost nobody actually applies on purpose. This particular pattern carries the name of Benjamin Franklin himself, and the actual story behind that name is genuinely worth knowing in full detail, not just as a passing footnote. Franklin, according to his own autobiography, once faced a rival legislator who actively disliked him and worked against him politically. Rather than trying to win the man over with gifts, flattery, or favors, Franklin did something almost counterintuitive. He heard the rival owned a rare, valuable book and simply asked to borrow it for a few days. The rival, apparently genuinely flattered by that specific and unusual request, sent the rare book over without much hesitation. Franklin returned the borrowed book about a week later, along with a brief, polite note of genuine thanks. The next time the two men crossed paths, the rival greeted him with unusual warmth and, according to Franklin's own account, remained a firm ally of his for the rest of the man's life. Franklin himself drew the lesson quite explicitly in his own later writing on the matter. He who has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. Psychologists eventually tested this formally, decades later, in controlled laboratory settings, running the experiment with strangers who had no prior history and no political rivalry to complicate the result, and the effect held up cleanly even under those far more sterile, controlled conditions. People asked to do a small favor for someone, particularly an unpleasant or unrewarding task, with no obvious external reason attached, consistently rated that person more favorably afterward than people who received a favor from that same individual instead. The mechanism researchers point to is a specific form of internal consistency, one closely related to and often described through the broader lens of cognitive dissonance theory. When you do something helpful for someone with no clear external reward attached, your own brain looks for an internal explanation for your own behavior. Absent an obvious external reason, the simplest available explanation your mind reaches for is that you must actually like this person, since why else would you have gone out of your way to help them? That manufactured liking isn't a conscious lie you're deliberately telling yourself in the moment. It genuinely, measurably changes how you feel about the other person afterward, and unlike a lot of fleeting psychological effects, it tends to genuinely stick around. Here's where this becomes directly useful for anyone managing people, and it's almost never used deliberately, which is exactly why it's worth naming out loud. New employees who feel isolated or disconnected from a team rarely warm up faster by receiving a steady stream of help and support from senior staff, even though that's the instinctive move most managers reach for first. Constant help can actually reinforce a subtle power imbalance, the new person as perpetual recipient, never contributor. They tend to integrate noticeably faster when a senior person does the reverse, asks them for a small favor, an opinion on a decision still being worked out, a quick read of a document before it goes out, a piece of specific expertise the new person happens to bring from a previous role. The senior person walks away from that small exchange having invested something personally, and it's the person who gives the favor who ends up feeling more connected to the relationship afterward, not the person who received help, which is the exact opposite of what most onboarding programs are built around. This shows up just as clearly in a much harder management scenario, repairing a genuinely strained relationship with a difficult or disengaged employee. The instinctive move here is almost always to offer more support, more resources, more flexibility, more accommodation, as a kind of peace offering. That approach rarely shifts a truly strained relationship much, because the employee often reads unearned generosity with suspicion rather than warmth, wondering what's actually being asked for underneath it. Asking that same employee for something small and genuine instead, their honest read on a plan you're genuinely unsure about, their specific expertise on a technical question, a piece of institutional history only they would know, does something a stack of concessions rarely manages. It signals real respect for their judgment, which is a fundamentally different message than an apology dressed up as a gift, and it works because it's the employee who ends up feeling invested in your success once they've helped you with something specific and real. There's a mechanism worth naming directly here, because it explains why this works better than the more obvious alternative. Doing favors for someone, especially someone you're trying to win over, frequently creates a subtle sense of obligation or even mild discomfort in the recipient, a feeling of being managed or handled rather than genuinely valued. Asking for a favor, instead, flips that entirely. It signals, implicitly, that you see something of real value in the other person, specifically their judgment, their skill, their perspective, worth going out of your way to access. That signal lands very differently than an unsolicited kindness, because it treats the other person as a source of value rather than a target of persuasion. It's worth being explicit about where the line sits here, because this technique can tip into something manipulative if it's used cynically rather than sincerely. The favor you ask for has to be genuinely useful to you, not a fake pretext manufactured purely to trigger the psychological effect. Asking someone for their honest opinion, then visibly ignoring it the moment you've gotten the social benefit of having asked, burns the exact trust this technique is supposed to build, usually permanently, and usually faster than the original relationship problem you were trying to solve. The favor has to be real, the need has to be real, and the respect implied by asking has to be real too, or the whole mechanism collapses into something people can feel being done to them rather than genuinely shared with them. There's a broader pattern this connects to that's worth understanding, because it shows up constantly outside individual relationships too. People consistently value things more and feel more attached to things the more effort or investment they've personally put into them. A closely related idea sometimes discussed alongside what's called the IKEA effect, where furniture people assemble themselves gets valued more highly than identical furniture that arrives pre-built. The underlying thread connecting both of these, investment creates attachment, more reliably and more durably than receiving something ready-made ever does, whether that investment is a small favor done for a colleague or a bookshelf assembled with your own hands on a Sunday afternoon. This same underlying mechanism shows up constantly in mentorship dynamics too. In a way, most organizations get completely backwards. Formal mentorship programs are almost always structured around the senior mentor giving advice, giving guidance, giving time to the junior mentee, a one-directional flow of help downward. That structure is intuitive, and it's also precisely why so many formal mentorship programs quietly fail to produce genuinely warm, durable relationships, evaluated years later by participants themselves. The mentor gives, the mentee receives, and very little genuine attachment forms on either side, because the relationship never asks the senior person to invest anything of their own beyond time and advice they were already comfortable giving. The mentorship pairs that actually last, the ones people still describe as meaningful a decade later, almost always involve the mentor asking the mentee for something too at some point. A fresh perspective on a problem the mentor is genuinely stuck on, an honest read on something the mentor is too close to see clearly, a specific skill the junior person happens to have that the senior person doesn't. The moment that exchange becomes even slightly reciprocal, the relationship stops being purely transactional guidance and starts becoming something both people are actually invested in keeping alive. It's worth pausing on why this effect is so consistently underused by managers who would otherwise describe themselves as good at building relationships. Asking someone for a favor requires a specific kind of vulnerability that giving a favor doesn't. Offering help puts you in the comfortable, controlled position of the person with something to give. Asking for help puts you in the more exposed position of the person with a need, admitting there's something you don't already have handled yourself. Most managers, especially newer ones still establishing authority, instinctively avoid that exposed position precisely when using it deliberately would do more for the relationship than another year of quietly being helpful ever will. Consider how this plays out concretely across a single team over the span of a few months. A manager who consistently offers help, covers for people, smooths over problems, and asks for very little in return often ends up respected but not particularly close to the team, viewed more like a competent service provider than a genuine ally. A manager who occasionally, genuinely asks the team for something, their honest take on a rough plan, help thinking through a real problem, a specific skill only one person on the team happens to have, tends to build a noticeably warmer, more collaborative dynamic over that same stretch of time, purely because the team has been given real opportunities to invest in the relationship rather than only ever receiving from it. This dynamic also explains a pattern many managers notice but rarely name correctly: why cross-team relationships built purely on formal requests, one department submitting a ticket, another department fulfilling it, so often stay cold and transactional for years, even between people who work closely together on paper. The relationship consists entirely of one side asking and the other side delivering, with the direction of the ask never reversing. Compare that to two peers in different departments who occasionally ask each other for a genuine opinion outside the formal request system entirely, a quick gut check on an idea, an honest read on how something will land with a different audience. Those informal, reciprocal little favors, small and low stakes as they are, tend to build far warmer, more durable cross-team relationships than years of purely formal, one-directional service requests ever managed to produce, purely because they introduce the exact two-way investment that a pure vendor and requester relationship never contains. There's also a useful negative case worth naming, because it shows precisely where this effect stops working. If the favor asked for is transparently fake, an obvious pretext with no real substance behind it, "Can you help me pick a font for this slide?" When there's clearly no genuine need for input, the effect collapses immediately, because the recipient can tell there's no real investment being requested, only a performance of one. The psychological mechanism depends specifically on the favor being real enough that granting it required actual effort or actual judgment from the other person. A fake ask, transparent as a social maneuver, produces the opposite of warmth, mild irritation at being used as a prop in someone else's relationship-building exercise. This is exactly why sincerity isn't an optional nice-to-have layered on top of the technique. It's the entire mechanism. Remove it, and what's left isn't a weaker version of the same effect. It's a different, much less useful interaction entirely. Managers who get the most consistent value out of this approach tend to share one specific habit. They keep a running, honest mental list of small things they're genuinely unsure about, a plan they haven't fully thought through, a piece of writing they're not confident lands well, a decision where they'd value a second opinion. And they deliberately bring that list to different people across the team over time, rather than always defaulting to the same one or two trusted favorites. Spreading genuine small asks across more of the team, instead of concentrating them on whoever's easiest to ask, does double duty. It builds this specific kind of warm investment with a much wider slice of the people you manage, not just the 2 or 3 you'd have gravitated toward anyway, and it surfaces a wider range of honest perspective in the process, which is useful on its own merits, entirely separate from the relationship benefit. Here's the part that surprises most people once they actually try applying this deliberately. The size of the favor barely matters. A tiny, specific, genuine ask, borrow a book, get an honest opinion, request a small piece of help, works just as reliably as a large one, and often works better because a small ask feels easy to grant without much deliberation, which means the psychological mechanism kicks in with almost no friction or hesitation on the other person's part. A large, burdensome favor request can backfire entirely, since granting it under visible reluctance short-circuits the exact internal reasoning, "I must like this person," that makes the whole effect work in the first place. It's also worth noting how differently this plays out depending on where someone sits in a hierarchy relative to you specifically. Asking a peer for a genuine favor tends to feel natural and low risk to most people, which is exactly why peer relationships often already benefit from this effect without anyone consciously trying to invoke it. Asking someone senior to you for a small piece of genuine help feels riskier, more exposed, and is precisely why so few junior employees ever try it deliberately, even though it works just as well in that direction. And asking someone junior to you for something real, rather than only ever handing help downward, is the specific direction most managers never consider at all, purely because organizational habit trains everyone to assume help only flows one way, downward from senior to junior, when the psychological mechanism behind this effect doesn't actually care which direction the request travels in. So here's the concrete, practical takeaway. The next time you want to strengthen a working relationship, Whether it's a brand new hire you want to integrate faster, or a genuinely strained relationship you're trying to repair, resist the instinct to reach for a gift, a favor, or an unearned kindness as your opening move. Ask that person for something small, specific, and genuinely useful to you instead. Their honest opinion on something you're not sure about, their particular expertise on something outside your own, a small piece of real help with something you're currently stuck on. You'll very likely walk away from that single exchange with a noticeably warmer relationship than any well-intentioned gift or gesture could ever have manufactured on its own. And so, more importantly, for how the relationship actually holds up over time, will they? More management theories like this hit follow, especially if you're genuinely trying to build a real working relationship with the people you actually manage, not merely collect the trivia version of the story to repeat later.